In Chapter 4, we'll discuss the largest and most visible organ of the body, the skin. We'll also discuss the body's membranes and cancer. Welcome to Part 1 of Chapter 4. In Section 1, we'll talk about the membranes of the body. In Section 2, the integumentary system and its functions. In Section 3, we'll talk about the layers of the skin. In Section 4, skin color. Section 5, the accessories or appendages of the skin. And in Section 6, we'll talk about various problems or homeostatic imbalances that can arise in the skin, including skin cancer, and we'll have a broader discussion of cancer in general. Section 1, the body membranes. The body membranes are flat sheets of pliable tissue. They're composed of many cells. They're not to be confused with the cell membranes on an individual cell. Body membranes cover the surfaces of the body, line body cavities, provide protective sheets around our organs, and there are two broad categories of body membranes: epithelial membranes and connective membranes. Let's begin with the epithelial membranes. As the name implies, they are composed in part of epithelial tissue, but they're also composed of an underlying connective tissue. There are three types of epithelial membranes: cutaneous, mucous, and serous membranes. The cutaneous membranes, or skin, covers the outer surface of the body. The cutaneous membranes are unique in that they are exposed to air, and they are relatively dry. There are two layers of the cutaneous membrane: the outer epidermis, which is superficial, to the dermis, the deeper layer. The second type of epithelial membranes are the mucous membranes. They line cavities that open to the exterior of the body. They line the respiratory, gastrointestinal, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Mucous membranes are composed of cells that are connected tightly together. This functions to stop pathogens from entering our bodies and prevents fluids from leaking out. Many of the mucous membranes secrete mucus. The epithelial tissue of these membranes is mostly stratified squamous or simple columnar type epithelial tissues. Recall from Chapter 3, this means the cells are either flat with many layers or tall and in a single layer. The connective tissue of body membranes is called the lamina propria. The third and final type of epithelial membrane is the serous membrane. Serous membranes line body cavities that are closed to the exterior. In other words, they never come in contact with the outside environment. Serous membranes are composed of simple squamous epithelium and connective tissue. Serous membranes come in pairs or layers, known as the parietal layer, which is attached to the cavity wall, and the visceral layer, attached to the organs within that cavity. Our internal organs come in contact with the organs around them and the wall of the cavity in which they're located. They need to be able to move against these structures with very little friction. That's the function of the serous fluid. It's a thin layer of watery fluid located between the parietal and visceral layers and is used for lubrication. There are three specific serous membranes to know: the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, the pleura, which surrounds our lungs, and the peritoneum, which lines the abdominal cavity. In the picture below, you can see the pericardium and pleura. To review, there are two major types of body membranes: epithelial membranes, which were composed of both epithelial and connective tissues, and connective membranes, which are composed solely of connective tissue. There is only one type of connective membrane to know: the synovial membranes. These membranes line cavities of freely moving joints like your knees and elbows. Synovial membranes lack epithelia and are filled with a fluid called synovial fluid, which lubricates the joint. Section 2, the integumentary system and its functions. The integumentary system is composed of the skin, the hair, the glands in the skin, and the other accessory organs. The integumentary system protects us from infections, dehydration or drying out, chemical damage, and damage from the sun, particularly ultraviolet light. The skin also regulates our body temperature by holding in heat due to the presence of adipose tissue or fat cells, helps us cool off by releasing sweat, and can also cool or keep us warm with blood vessel constriction and dilation. Another important function of the skin is its role in the production of vitamin D. Vitamin D, like other vitamins, is important for our health. Vitamin D aids in the absorption of calcium from our intestines. The production of vitamin D begins in our skin in the form of cholesterol, the same molecule that's found in our cell membranes. Cholesterol is converted into a vitamin D precursor in our skin, and this process requires sunlight. There are additional steps to convert the vitamin D precursor into vitamin D, which we'll talk about in the other organ systems. Additionally, our integumentary system plays a role in sensation. We can feel pain, temperature, pressure, and vibration through our skin. All of these sensations provide a protective role and ensure that we don't take part in behaviors that might be damaging to our bodies. The integumentary system plays a small role in the removal of wastes from our body, including the excretion of salts and urea. Our integumentary system includes our hair and nails, which provide numerous functions for the body, including the stimulation of reflexes. Hair is in contact with sensory neurons that signal our brain when touched. Our hair is attached to small, smooth muscles called erector pili muscles, which produce goosebumps when stimulated. Our skin provides protection from ultraviolet light. Our nails help us grip objects, and in some animals the nails are modified into hooves, claws, or horns. In Section 3, we'll discuss the layers of the skin. Our skin is made up of many different layers. Some layers are even subdivided into more layers. But let's begin with the three main layers of the skin. The epidermis is the outermost or superficial layer. The dermis is in between the other two layers. The deepest layer is the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. The prefixes should help you remember the locations of the different layers. Epi means upon or above, so the epidermis is above the others. And hypo means less than or below. It's the layer deepest in the skin. This diagram represents the integumentary system, and it depicts the three different layers. Up above we have the epidermis. In the middle, the thickest layer in this diagram is the dermis, and below that we have the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. The epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelial cells and includes 5 principal cell types, including the keratinocytes or keratinocytes, stem cells, melanocytes, Langerhans cells, and tactile or Merkel cells. The epidermis is subdivided into several layers. The deepest layer is called the stratum basale. It's composed of a single row of cuboidal keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are cells that make an abundance of the protein keratin. Recall from Chapter 3 that keratin is a type of cytoskeleton, specifically intermediate filaments. As these cells grow, they are pushed toward the surface of our skin. Some cells in the stratum basale are stem cells, and they divide and give rise to the keratinocyte. Scattered throughout the stratum basale are melanocytes, which make the pigment melanin. Melanin is transferred to neighboring keratinocytes, and these cells use the pigment to protect their DNA from damage due to UV light exposure. Within the stratum basale are a few tactile or Merkel cells, which transfer sensations of touch to sensory neurons. This picture shows the layers of the epidermis. Let's focus on the stratum basale, the deepest layer. You can see the stratum basale here, a single layer of mostly cuboidal cells. Also included in the stratum basale are melanocytes. The dark specks are packets of melanin, which are transferred again to the neighboring keratinocytes. Also in this layer are dividing cells. These would be stem cells. You can see the cell is in anaphase of mitosis. We also have tactile or Merkel cells. Here you can see it's in contact with a sensory neuron. The layer above or superficial to the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum, or spiny layer. This is composed of several layers of keratinocytes. These keratinocytes are more keratinized than the keratinocytes from the layer below. As they gain more and more keratin, they begin to flatten. There are a few cells in the stratum spinosum that can still divide. In this layer, you will also find the Langerhans cells. These are cells that migrate from the bone marrow and provide an immune function, and that they guard against pathogens. Here we can see the stratum spinosum, located above the stratum basale. Within the stratum spinosum are numerous keratinocytes, which, when prepared for a microscope, look spiny, hence the name. Also in the stratum spinosum is the Langerhans, or immune cells. The next layer up is the stratum granulosum. It's composed of several layers of keratinocytes. These cells are undergoing cell death as they accumulate more and more keratin. These cells are so packed with keratin that the organelles begin to disappear, and they contain numerous dark staining keratohyalin granules. You can see these granules under a microscope, hence the name stratum granulosum. These granules are made of proteins that help assemble additional keratin. Here you can see the stratum granulosum. Notice that the cells are even more flattened than the layer below, and you can just make out the keratohyalin granules. The next layer up is the stratum lucidum. It is also composed of several layers of keratinocytes. The cells of this layer are completely dead and have accumulated even more keratin. Under a microscope, the cells appear transparent. Lucidum is Latin for clear. The stratum lucidum is only found in some regions of the body. Because of this additional layer, the skin in these areas is referred to as thick skin. Thick skin can be found on the palms of our hands and soles of our feet, where it provides an additional layer of protection. Thick skin is completely hairless. Finally, you have the most superficial layer of the epidermis, the stratum corneum, which is composed of numerous layers of keratinocytes. The stratum corneum is thicker in thick skin. Cells of this layer are completely dead. They're very flat, and they contain no organelles, not even a nucleus. The stratum corneum is very durable and is designed to resist abrasion and exposure to heat. In this diagram, I've highlighted the stratum corneum, the most superficial layer, and stratum lucidum, the layer just below it. Both of these layers are composed of dead keratinocytes. Notice there's no organelles or nuclei in any of these cells. This is a picture of a section of skin under a microscope. You can see both the dermis and epidermis. Take a moment to identify each layer of the epidermis. Compare the layers of real epidermis to those depicted by an artist from the previous slide. The keratinocytes of the epidermis undergo a process called keratinization. Stem cells in the stratum basale are constantly dividing. New cells are pushed toward the surface to the overlying layers. As the cells travel upward, they accumulate more and more keratin. This is called keratinization. Our skin contains blood vessels, but they are not found in the epidermis. This means that as cells travel to the apical surface, they get further from the blood, the sole source of nutrients. Between keratin accumulation and lack of blood, keratinocytes die as they push upward. Desquamation refers to the normal growth and shedding of dead cells at the surface of the epidermis. At this point, you should take a moment to review the layers of the epidermis. For example, what is the name of the deepest layer of the epidermis? Is it A, stratum lucidum, B, stratum corneum, C, stratum basale, D, stratum spinosum, or E, stratum granulosum? That concludes part 1 of our voiceover lecture for chapter 4 on the skin and membranes.